there, and welcome to the Unit 5 review for the AP U.S. History curriculum. Now, this unit covers the time period from 1844 to 1877, and it's pretty well dominated by the Civil War. So we're going to talk about the causes of the war, which has a lot to do with westward expansion. We're going to talk about the Civil War itself, like how it was fought and the effects that it had both on Northern society and Southern society. And we're going to consider what happened after the war, namely the period of Reconstruction. So I'm feeling like you're ready to get them brain cows milked. Let's do it. So our consideration with everything that went on during this period really needs to start with one of the prevailing ideas of the time, namely manifest destiny. This idea was deeply rooted in the American imagination, and it basically meant this: that Americans believed themselves to have a God-given right to possess a nation from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. This notion of expansion would continue into the next period to include islands in the Pacific and the Caribbean as well, but I get ahead of myself. We'll look at that in Unit 6. But there were a few reasons that Americans embraced this idea of manifest destiny. First, further expansion westward would grant them access to more natural and mineral resources. Second, but those are among the most important. Now, as you probably remember, Americans have been pushing west since the colonial period, but there were a few western territories that stirred up a feverish desire for further expansion during this period. And just for poops and giggles, let's begin with Texas. Now, Americans have been settling in Texas since the 1820s when it was still Mexican territory.
Son, don't mess with Texas.
I mean, I wasn't planning to. I was just...
well, you just said we was Mexican.
Yeah, Texas was originally a Mexican territory.
Son, I done told you not to mess with Texas. We've been Americans since the dawn of history in 1845.
Fair enough. Anyway, by 1830, there were 3 times as many Americans in the Texas territory as Mexicans, and the majority of those settlers were Southern, and as such, they were Protestant and had brought the institution of slavery with them. In 1829, the Mexican government, annoyed by this development, decreed 2 things that, to put it mildly, were unpalatable to the Americans living in that territory. First, the Mexican government mandated conversion to Roman Catholicism. Second, they outlawed slavery. Not surprisingly, the American settlers rejected these terms, and so the Mexican government, in response to further immigration. You heard me right. The Mexican government shut down the border to American immigration. But you can't shut down westward migration that easily, because baby, it's manifestly destined. So the Americans just kept coming in, and they kept being Protestant, and they kept bringing the slaves right along with them. Now, the tension between the American Texans and the Mexican government reached a boiling point in 1835, and it's at that point that the Texans revolted. Eventually, the Texans captured the leader of the Mexican troops and forced him to sign a treaty recognizing Texan independence. Now, that general was not authorized to sign such a treaty, of course, and so while the Texans were raising their glasses to independence, the Mexican government received news of this treaty and refused to recognize its legitimacy. So as Texas applied to become the newest state of the Union, they were initially rejected because to accept the new state would almost surely mean war with Mexico. More on that later. All right, now let's go a little bit north and talk about westward expansion into the Oregon Territory. Now, both the British and the Americans claimed rights to this territory, and the British did so because they had established a profitable fur trade there, but relatively few British folk actually lived in the territory. Much greater in number were the American settlers, mainly missionaries and farmers, who had been settling there in the thousands. So the reason that the Americans felt that they had claim to that territory was because, they were there and, manifest destiny. And that brings us to the election of 1844, in which James K. Polk became the president. This election is important to everything I just said, because Polk was a big believer in manifest destiny. He made all sorts of campaign promises regarding Texas and Oregon, and he wanted to go ahead and throw in California just for poops and giggles. And as I said, Polk won that election and interpreted that as a mandate from the people to add those territories to the Union. And seeing the way the sentiment of the country was going, the outgoing president John Tyler went ahead and scored a point for his legacy by pushing through the annexation of Texas. And once Polk got into office, he went ahead and took care of Oregon, splitting the territory with the British at the 49th parallel. All right, remember when I said we get back to Texas? Well, now's the time. Once Texas was officially annexed into the Union, it had the expected effect, and that's when we get the Mexican-American War. And especially at stake in this conflict was the southern border of Texas. Americans claimed it was the Rio Grande, but Mexicans said that it was the Nueces River. And that's no small difference, and so the war began when President Polk sent General Zachary Taylor to advance troops toward the Rio Grande. Mexican troops met them and ended up killing 11 Americans, and so on April 25th, 1846, the war officially began. Long story short, relatively small bands of American troops were able to gain enough ground against the Mexicans, and they even captured Mexico City in 1847 in order to claim California and New Mexico as territory of their own. The war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, and this treaty established the southern border of the United States at the Rio Grande, and it granted a huge portion of land known as the Mexican Cession to the United States, which, as I mentioned, included California and New Mexico. Okay, now that was the end of the war, but I need to back up just a little bit and tell you about something that happened at the beginning of the war, because that's going to help you understand where we're going next. During the first year of the war, an amendment was attached to an appropriations bill in Congress. It was called the Wilmot Proviso, and it stipulated that any land that was gained from the Mexican-American War would be ineligible for the spread of slavery. Now, the amendment was struck down in the Senate, so nothing really came of it, but the importance of that proviso is in its symbolic value. What it symbolized was the growing tension over westward expansion and the question of slavery, and that will be a major theme until it all erupts into a civil war, but again, I'd get ahead of myself. Now, westward migration continued after the Mexican-American War, and one of the significant drivers of that was the gold rush of 1848. Gold was discovered in the hills of California, and so settlers streamed into that new territory in haste, and they set up mining camps and ramshackle towns with incredible speed. And just to give you a sense of the scale, the California population in 1848 was about 14,000, but by 1860, it was just under 400,000. And so as this is going on, and further westward migration is happening in other territories, the question about the expansion of slavery is starting to heat up as well. We can basically break down the argument into 3 positions. First was the southern position, and they argued that slavery was a constitutional right, and they believed that with all this new territory, the line slave states, which was established in the Missouri Compromise, ought to extend all the way to the Pacific. They were pretty sensitive about the slavery issue, and for them, any attempt to curtail slavery was a move towards its entire destruction. The second position in this argument was the free soil position. Northern Democrats and Whigs wanted all the land gained in the West to be free territory, but before you go patting them on the back, you should know that their vision for Western lands was one of white opportunity and prosperity. So yes, they didn't want enslaved blacks in the West, but many of them also didn't want free blacks in the West either. Another group that made up the free soil position were the abolitionists, and these folks wanted to ban slavery not just in the Western territories, but everywhere. Some of these folks went on to form a new political party called the Free Soil Party, and this party wasn't made up of all abolitionists, but the cessation of slavery was certainly a significant piece of their platform. The third position in this debate was the argument for popular sovereignty. And what this means is that it would be up to the people living in the territories to decide for themselves whether their state would be a free state or a slave state. Now, as this fight is brewing and the tension is growing, the question about admitting California and New Mexico came front and center. Both of them wanted to enter the Union as free states, but that would be untenable, as I mentioned in the last unit, because that would throw off the balance of free states and slave states in the Senate. And that's when our boy Henry Clay stepped in and created a compromise to keep the Union together. It was called the Compromise of 1850, and here are the key provisions. First, the Mexican cession would be divided into the Utah and New Mexico territories, and each of them would decide the slavery question by popular sovereignty. Second, California would be admitted as a free state. Third, the slave trade would be outlawed in Washington, D.C. And fourth, Congress would pass a stricter Fugitive Slave Act that would enable planters in the South to get their slaves back when they tried to escape to the North. Now, this compromise did end up calming everybody down for a little while, but it was that provision for a Fugitive Slave Act that caused some serious problems, and it's not hard to understand why. To Northerners, slavery was a Southern thing. Now, of course, there were lots of abolitionists in the North, and they wanted to ban slavery everywhere. However, for many Northerners, they weren't necessarily opposed to the institution of slavery, they just didn't want it to spread anywhere. As long as it stayed in the South, no problem. But with this fugitive slave law, slavery came right into their backyard. Now all of a sudden, Northerners were legally responsible for reporting runaway slaves and facilitating their return. It was annoying for dang near everybody in the North, but it was an intolerable position, especially for the abolitionists. And the tension just kept increasing from there. And I'll give you a few examples. The Underground Railroad was picking up steam during this time, and this was a series of trails and safe houses by which Southern slaves were given safe passage to the North. Tens of thousands of slaves made this dangerous trek, fleeing the plantations, and to the great consternation of the plantation owners. Then there was the publication of Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was a fictionalized account of Southern slavery that exposed the brutal and paternalistic nature of the institution, and it quickly became the best-selling book in America. More than anything, the popularity of this book helped stoke the northern fires of abolition, which in turn further polarized the nation. And then there was the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. Now, the Nebraska Territory was still unorganized, but the population was growing and soon would be eligible to apply for statehood, and then again, the slavery question would break everybody's dang mind. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act divided the Nebraska Territory into two sections, Kansas and Nebraska. Additionally, it was decided that when these territories applied for statehood, the slavery question will be decided by popular sovereignty. Now, that might seem like a decent middle road to you, but that one decision set off a firestorm in the North. And the reason why is because it effectively overturned the Missouri Compromise, which had nigh unto scriptural authority for the North. In case you need a refresher on the Missouri Compromise, it was decided in 1820 that there would be no slavery in the western territories above the southern border of Missouri, except in Missouri, of course. And unless my eyes doth deceive me, Kansas and Nebraska are pretty dang squarely north of that line. And so as a result of this act, fighting broke out between the anti-slavery and the pro-slavery factions in that territory. This became known as Bleeding Kansas. When it came time to set up a legislature for that state, Missourians started pouring over the border and set up a pro-slavery legislature in Compton. But the anti-slavery folks refused to recognize the legitimacy of that legislature and set up their own legislature. That section of the country was a hot mess during this time, and it further fueled the division between the rest of the country. Now, one effect of the Kansas-Nebraska fiasco was the birth of the Republican Party. They were a coalition of free soilers and anti-slavery Whigs and Democrats, and their main goal was to stop the spread of slavery. We're just going to leave them right there for now, and we'll circle back in just a minute. All right, so let's continue talking about the events that fueled sectional division during this time. How about we check in with the Supreme Court? And here we need to talk about a lightning rod of a case called Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857. So the story in brief is that Dred Scott was a slave in Missouri, but was taken by his enslaver to live for 2 years in the free state of Wisconsin. So Scott sued for his freedom, arguing that his time living on free soil meant that he was in fact a free man. Chief Justice Roger Taney, who was a Southern Democrat, handed down a decision along with the majority of the court ruling against Scott. And the reasons for this ruling will be important for you to know. First, they argue that slaves are not technically citizens and therefore are ineligible to sue in federal court. Second, slaves were considered property, and the Constitution explicitly states that no person can be deprived of their property except by due process of law. And in case you don't see the implication in all this, let me explain it up real nice for you. If a master could take his slave, which was deemed his property, anywhere in the United States, no matter where the territory was, and not be deprived of his property, that means, in effect, that slavery could exist anywhere in the United States. And finally, we need to talk about our good buddy John Brown. Brown was a militant abolitionist from Kansas, and in 1859, he led a small group of followers on a raid at the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. His goal was to seize weapons and ammunition and arm the southern slave population, and then incite an uprising. Now, 2 days after the raid, the rebellion was squashed, and John Brown was later hanged, but the effect of this event was acute. In John Brown's raid, Southerners thought they could finally discern the true intentions of the North to dismantle the South with slave rebellion. And the final event that put on display the depth of America's sectional division was the election of 1860. The Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas as their candidate, and then the Republicans went with Abraham Lincoln. Now, Lincoln was explicit in his campaign rhetoric that he did not oppose slavery existing in the South. He just wanted to keep it from spreading. And what's astonishing is that Lincoln won the presidency without a single Southern electoral vote, mainly owing to the North's larger population and therefore its larger electoral strength. And the South could see the writing on the wall. They could see that they had no longer any voice in America's political future regarding slavery, and therefore they went ahead and seceded from the Union. The first to secede was South Carolina in December of 1860. And within 6 weeks, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana seceded too. Together, the secessionist states joined themselves together into the Confederate States of America. They wrote a constitution that was similar to the United States Constitution, with the main differences being a strict limitation on federal power and the enshrinement of slavery as a perpetual institution. And ladies and gentlemen, that's how you get a civil war going. Now, once the shooting had begun at Fort Sumter, a few other states went ahead and joined the Confederacy as well, namely Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Now, it's going to be important for you to also seceded from the Union. Delaware, Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland were slave states, but they did not secede and thus remained part of the Union. Now, understanding this is important as we get into the strategies of the war. Lincoln's goal explicitly was to save the Union. That's why it took him about a year and a half to make a proclamation to free the slaves. To do so, he would have alienated the slave border states that remained in the Union, and Lincoln felt that to keep the border states was vital to a Union victory. And this tells us that from the Northern perspective, that the war was not entirely about slavery, at least not in the beginning. Now, both the North and the South had distinct advantages when it came to fighting this war. For the South, their main advantages were, number one, fighting a defensive war, and number two, much better generals like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. But the North, on the other hand, had a population on its side, which is to say about about 4 times the amount of people than were in the South. The North also had a robust navy which would enable them to control the seas and rivers. Additionally, the North had the economic advantage since they had most of the nation's banks, was home to much of the nation's manufacturing, and held about 70% of the nation's railroads. And a very vigorous executive. And on this last point, the South really suffered. I mean, if you read the Articles of Secession from South Carolina, it's basically a tirade against the power of the federal government. And so when the South set up their own government, most of the power resided in the states to the expense of the federal government. And this arrangement would actually make it very difficult both to wage war and to finance the war. Now, a main plank of the Union strategy during the war was the use of the U.S. Navy to form a blockade of southern seaports and eventually gain control of the Mississippi River, thus cutting the Confederacy in half. And it was called the Anaconda Plan. The Confederate strategy relied on help from foreign countries, namely Britain and France. And why would Britain and France help the Confederacy? Well, because they relied heavily on southern cotton to make their textile mills run. So the South believed that King Cotton would convince them to send aid. But what the South did not count on is to have Britain and France go looking for cotton elsewhere and find it in India and Egypt. Now, after about 18 months of fighting, Lincoln enlarged the purpose of the war from just saving the Union to ending slavery as well. He did this on September 22nd, 1862 with the Emancipation Proclamation. Free on January 1st of the next year. Now, notice how the proclamation only freed the slaves in the rebellious states, which is to say the Confederate states. This means that slavery remained as an institution in the border states that were still in the Union. And so it seems pretty clear that the Emancipation Proclamation was just part of Lincoln's military strategy in order to preserve the Union. And why do I say that? Well, let's look at the effect that the proclamation had. As I said before, the proclamation enlarged the purpose and scope of the war to include the abolishment of slavery. And therefore, this enlarged scope convinced Britain not to send aid to the South because of their recent abolitionist past. And there are other reasons why no foreign country sent aid to the South, but that's beyond the scope of this. But another effect of the proclamation was to empower enslaved blacks to flee their plantations and join up with the Union Army. And it wasn't as though these fleeing slaves added huge numbers to the Union ranks, but it was the symbolic value of it that really demoralized the South. Now, at the beginning of the war, the South kind of mopped the floor with the Union, but now let's look at how the tide of victory began to rise for the Union. The Union victory in the Battle of Vicksburg granted the North control over the entire Mississippi River, which, as they hoped, cut the Confederacy in half. After the Battle of Gettysburg, Lincoln made an effort to unite the country and portray the struggle against slavery as the fulfillment of America's founding ideals by emphasizing that all men are created equal, and a government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Additionally, Ulysses S. Grant became the commanding general of the Union Army, and he was finally a general who could put the Southerners on their heels. He pressured the Confederates hard, and he never let up. Additionally, he sent General William Tecumseh Sherman to invade Georgia, and once he did, Sherman captured Atlanta and led his men on a march hundreds of miles to the Georgia coast, burning and devastating the land as they went. And so, with the combination of the naval blockade, which caused food and supplies to run dry in the South, and all the destruction which severely demoralized the Southerners, General Lee surrendered to General Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, and the war was over. And thankfully, once the fighting had ceased, the North and the South gave each other a big constitutional hug and cried on each other's shoulders and lived happily ever after the end. Wouldn't that be hilarious if that's how it went? That is in fact not how it went, and that brings us to the period within this period known as Reconstruction. Now, the chief question being batted around the halls of power in the Union after the war was over was this: should the South be treated with leniency, or should they be treated as conquered foes? Lincoln was of the lenient persuasion, and his plan for Reconstruction showed that leniency. You see, Lincoln believed that the South never actually left the Union, since it's illegal and unconstitutional for a state to ever break up the Union, and therefore he proposed like a minimum test of political loyalty for the states of the Confederacy to enter back into the Union. First, he proposed that if only 10% of the population swore an oath of allegiance to the Union and the Constitution, then those states could reestablish their state governments. Second, each state was required to ratify the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery in the United States. And so in that way, I suppose Lincoln was trying to give the South a big hug. But then he went ahead and got himself assassinated in Ford's Theater on April 14, 1865. On April 14, 1865, about 3 weeks before the official end of the war. And so his vice president, Andrew Johnson, became president, and to his credit, he attempted to carry out Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction. But Johnson soon found himself embroiled in an epic fight with a group in Congress called the Radical Republicans. Now, there were also moderate Republicans in Congress, but their goals were slightly different. The Radicals pushed hard for civil rights for blacks, whereas the moderate Republicans were really only concerned about economic gains for whites. However, Johnson went ahead and alienated both of those groups by vetoing legislation aimed at both of those goals. But it's the Radical Republicans that we really need to focus on. You see, as champions for civil rights for blacks, the Radical Republicans desperately wanted to punish the South for their secession. And the more Johnson antagonized this group, the more they wanted to shift the process of Reconstruction from a presidential one to a congressional one. And as it turns out, they were successful in this regard. And the Radical Republicans got a few stunning legislative victories. First was the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and it proclaimed that all blacks were officially citizens of the United States. And as a such, Act overturned the Dred Scott decision, which we talked about earlier. Now, Johnson, being his pugnacious and rascally self, vetoed the Civil Rights Act, but the Radical Republicans in Congress convinced enough people in Congress to override his veto. However, the Radical Republicans feared that future Congresses could overturn the Civil Rights Act, and so they went ahead and proposed a new constitutional amendment. And so we get the 14th Amendment, which stated that all persons born or naturalized in the United States were in fact citizens of the United States. And secondly, that no state could deny a citizen of any race equal protection of the laws. The third major legislative victory for the Republican Congress was the Reconstruction Act, and again, Johnson vetoed it, but Congress overrode the veto, and we got the following. The Reconstruction Act divided the South into 5 zones which would be subject to military occupation, and this was to the end that Southerners wouldn't break the new laws being imposed upon them. Additionally, these acts increased the requirements for states rejoining the Union. Now they also had to ratify the 14th Amendment and add clauses in their state constitutions providing for universal male suffrage, which is to say the right to vote. And now things were really heating up between the Radical Republicans and Johnson, and the cherry of Andrew Johnson. Just as a side note, so you understand what it means, when people talk in normal conversation about impeachment, what they usually mean is removal from office. But that is not what impeachment means. Impeachment is just the trial and the process to remove someone from office. So it's not the removal itself. So just take that, stick it in your brain folds, it'll help you out later in life. Anyway, Congress was itching for a fight with Andrew Johnson, so they passed the Tenure of Office Act in 1867. It basically said that the president cannot remove a member of his cabinet without congressional approval. And here they were essentially baiting Johnson because his Secretary of War was a Radical Republican, and as the Secretary of War, he was responsible for carrying out the congressional plans for Reconstruction, which, as I mentioned before, Johnson was opposed to. So of course, Johnson would want to get rid of that guy and replace him with somebody who was more sympathetic to his own plans for Reconstruction. And the Tenure of Office Act made made that virtually impossible. But Johnson went ahead and fired his Secretary of War and violated the Tenure of Office Act, and they went ahead and drew up the Articles of Impeachment. And after a 3-month trial, Congress came up just 1 vote short of removing him from office. And so Johnson remained the president after his impeachment, which is what time to define impeachment for you, because if you hear that he was impeached and then remained in office, it might make you go, what? Anyway, the last major legislative move that this Congress made that you need to be aware about is the passage of the 15th Amendment. It was ratified in 1870, and it took pains to protect the voting rights of former slaves. So, just to review the constitutional amendments ratified during this phase, you have the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment made all persons born or naturalized in the United States citizens and guaranteed them equal protection of the laws. And the 15th Amendment protected the voting rights of former slaves. Although on that last one, I should mention that the fullness of that protection wouldn't bear fruit for another century. Okay, so that's what was going on in the halls of power during Reconstruction. Now let's turn our attention towards society in the South during the same period. Having been recently emancipated, the now free blacks of the South were coming to terms with their new reality. And so one movement they took up in order to gain their independence from white control was to establish black schools for children. They also established black institutions of higher learning like Morehouse and Howard colleges. The South even saw some of its first blacks elected to political office. However, despite gains like these, black independence from white South, of course, was still largely agricultural in its economics, and therefore they still needed laborers in the plantation. So their solution was to present blacks with contracts that perpetually bound them to the plantation and made provisions for unlimited amounts of labor. I really feel like there's a word for that, like, slavery. So that didn't work out too well, and now here's where I get to tell you about sharecropping. Under the system, the landlord provided seed and farm supplies in exchange for a share in the harvest. Now, in theory, I suppose this was a good opportunity for newly emancipated blacks to get on their feet and gain some independence. But in reality, many sharecroppers remained indebted to the landowners, and it really just became a new form of servitude, sort of like neo-slavery, not only for blacks, though, but also for poor whites. And since we're talking about society in the South during Reconstruction, well, I guess we ought to talk about white supremacy. It's not like they're lost in the Civil War, just like flipped a switch in the Southern mind, and they were all like, well, we lost the war, but what I never understood before is that us whites and you blacks are equal in dignity and honor, all God's children. Yeah, no. To dominate many who lived in the South. And to that end, they organized secret societies like the Ku Klux Klan or the KKK to terrorize blacks into submission. The Klan was formed in 1867 and was firmly rooted in the ideology of white supremacy. And their tactics included burning buildings and lynchings and gaining control over local politics. But don't worry, it wasn't just blacks they hated. They also hated Catholics and immigrants and Jews too. So at least they were equal opportunity haters. And in line with the ideology of white supremacy, Southern legislatures adopted what are called black codes. These laws prevented blacks from borrowing money to buy land and prevented them from even owning land. In addition, the laws prohibited blacks from testifying against whites in court and basically established the racial segregation of Southern society. So the process of Reconstruction, to put it mildly, was a hot mess. But the end of Reconstruction in 1877 was an even hotter mess. So by 1867, most of the federal troops had been withdrawn from the South, and now in 1877, it was time for a presidential election. The two contenders that year were Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel J. Tilden, and I assume, based on all that we have covered in this video, that you'll know where each of their sympathies lay. So the majority of the popular vote went to Tilden, but 3 states' votes were contested, and so a special commission was assembled to determine who got the most electoral votes. The votes in the commission went right along party lines. Because there was one more Republican in the commission than Democrats, their decision was for Hayes. But the Democrats threatened to filibuster this decision in the Senate, and so out of this fight, we got the Compromise of 1877. Basically, the Democrats allowed Hayes to have the presidency in return for the removal of all federal troops from the South. And that is exactly what happened. And now in the South, without federal troops there to enforce those laws, they were free to run their society any dang well they pleased. But that is a story we're going to have to pick up in the next unit. See you there.